Hello everyone and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys so very much for tuning into today's show, and it should be a fantastic Thursday show today. We are going to conclude our divisional fantasy previews, switching from the AFC to the NFC. We're going to close them out. We're also going to talk about a couple of fantasy football storylines that you might want to follow. And stick around to the end of today's show, where I'll be discussing my way too early 2024-25 fantasy hockey player rankings. It's winding down the season. Who knows if the Oilers can close it out and come back from down 3-0. So we'll never know, but we'll do a hockey segment for you guys today, and it should conclude our show in a very nice way. But before we begin with anything else, I always ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show in both Podcast Network and Sports Network pages or YouTube. We also do receive a lot of tips and donations, so if you do ever feel so inclined, please leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. You can also leave a question, comment, or concern about something I said on a prior segment, and I will address that at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's get right into today's show. Like I said before, we are going to be concluding our NFC Divisional Fantasy Previews, and today we start off up north in the NFC North, a very young, scrappy, hungry division that had a NFC Championship representative for the first time in many a year in the Detroit Lions, but this division definitely feels very player-centric, especially considering the fantasy implications that stem from it, because of the fact you now have two rookie quarterbacks in very exciting markets, in both Caleb Williams in Chicago and J.J. McCarthy in Minnesota. You have a team that has been laying in the weeds for many years in the Detroit Lions, who finally has a high-powered offense that will get the city excited again. And then you have one of the most sneaky teams in the entire NFL in the Green Bay Packers, who everyone thought would have a very rough transition from Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, but in fact it ended up going very seamlessly, and they themselves could have had a shot at making it to at least the NFC Championship. So as you can see, this definitely is a well-rounded division, and there's a lot of talent to choose from in your fantasy drafts. But without further ado, let's just jump right into a team-by-team breakdown. I was thinking maybe a position-by-position breakdown would be a bit more interesting for this division, but I think it's very appropriate that we dissect each team respectively due to the fact that there are so many storylines to choose from when we look at each of them. So let's start off with perhaps the new exciting team, mainly due to Caleb Williams arriving in the city of Chicago, the Chicago Bears. We'll talk a little bit about Caleb Williams tomorrow and his projections in another segment for that show. But Caleb Williams definitely brings an excitement that wasn't in Chicago before. Obviously, you had Justin Fields before, and there was a lot of hype surrounding him, mainly due to his dual threat ability, but he didn't pan out. Maybe you can say it was due to coaching scheme, we'll never know. But in comes Caleb Williams in his stead, and I think he's going to have a fantastic rookie season, mainly due to the weapons around him. This is the most well-rounded receiver core in this division, in my humble opinion, and with Caleb Williams throwing the ball to them, they could be primed for breakout campaigns. Let's start off with a guy in DJ Moore, who last year was the number one receiver. Maybe he's not this year, as they added Keenan Allen to this group. But DJ Moore had a fantastic year last year. 888 yards, 52.2 yards per game. He had 118 targets, only 63 receptions, but he did have 7 TDs. So as you can see, there's a little bit of instability in his statistics, but with a more established quarterback coming out of the college ranks in Caleb Williams, maybe that production goes up. I think that Caleb Williams is going to rely on DJ Moore a lot in the early goings, as he is an established part of the Chicago Bears for the past couple of years. He knows the system, and I think he's going to help break Caleb Williams in a little bit. So look for DJ Moore at the beginning of the year to potentially be a nice little fantasy option for you guys. But a guy who I really think is going to have an interesting campaign is their tight end, Cole Kmet. I had Cole Kmet last year. Obviously, a couple of disappointing games. He's a very hit or miss player. When he misses in spectacular fashion. But last year, with one of the worst quarterbacks in recent Chicago Bears history in Tyson Bagent, he was kind of playing very well, especially in the red zone. So look for Caleb Williams in a pinch in the red zone to look Cole Kmet's way. I think he's a solid tight end option. He had a career high in catches and receiving yards last year, even with unstable quarterback play. So Cole Kmet is someone who I'm going to keep my eye on. Potential steal in fantasy drafts, especially if you're looking for someone who can get a couple of touchdowns, steal a couple of touchdowns away from high-end receivers. But in terms of that position group, those two guys, in my opinion, are prime for breakout campaigns. Now, obviously, you bring in Rome Odunze as well from the draft from the University of Washington, and you acquire Keenan Allen from the Chargers. So Caleb Williams has a wealth of riches in that skill position group. But those two guys, in my humble opinion, are two guys I see as potential breakout candidates. Not necessarily guys who are going to be steady throughout. They could have very up and down games depending on certain weeks. But remember these two guys' names, because I believe that they will be the Chicago Bears that really helped Caleb Williams have an easy transition to the NFL. That being said, let's transition to the team that surprisingly won the division last year, centered around the philosophy of their coach Dan Campbell and a very hard-nosed game plan every single week. The Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions are quickly becoming one of the more attractive teams in terms of fantasy options, mainly because every single player in this squad has elevated their game. Let's start off with their quarterback, Jared Goff. He's not necessarily seen as a sexy fantasy quarterback pick, but his stats over the years do not lie. He has 289.1 fantasy points last year. That's solid for a QB. And he's a metronomic presence for the Detroit Lions. Has 9,000 yards through his first 48 games with them, his first two seasons. 75 touchdowns and 27 picks. So as you can see, he's not going to be one of those guys who's going to break out in terms of yardage, get a number of touchdowns, but he's very steady. He's one of the many quarterbacks I had streaming last year in my league, trying to find the right situation, and he was one of the most steady ones. Not mainly because of his big numbers or anything, but just because he can put up touchdowns, he can put up points, and he has a reliable offense that can get him going at any time. He's never down or out or low about his game. He always feels good because he knows his skill position. Talents are going to be there to uplift him. And so let's look at those skill position players. Starting off with a tight end who, while he definitely is going to be considered for the tight end one and was the consensus tight end one last year in fantasy, he's going to definitely have a lot of questions surrounding him because of the fact that it was the least impressive tight end fantasy season for a tight end one in recent years in Sam Laporta. He had 153.3 fantasy points. That's decent for a tight end. But the main question is, can he become even better? He's coming off an injury he sustained in the playoffs. And obviously, as a rookie, that's always difficult to come back from. But Sam Laporta, he was a steady presence in that system. Used in the seam a lot. Used in the slot. He can move around a lot. He's very versatile. So I think he can sustain that tight end one mark. It's just a question of how will his production elevate from last year, especially in a receiving core that includes a guy in Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is absolutely incredible. Fantastic route runner, fantastic catcher of the football. So let's just go over his stats, and they speak for themselves. 1,161 yards last year for 72.6 yards per game on 146 targets and 106 receptions for 6 TDs. So as you can see, whatever Jared Goff needs him to do, Amon-Ra St. Brown can do it, and efficiently. He can run routes. He can get yards after the catch. He's just a strong receiver at the catch point. So look for him to be targeted early and often. So if you're in a PPR league, Amon-Ra St. Brown can be the number one pick for you in terms of that Lions system. But overall, the Lions are the most attractive team. Now let's get to the last two teams. Obviously, the Minnesota Vikings. I certainly think that J.J. McCarthy can start a couple of games, but I believe that Sam Darnold is going to start the season off. But you're going to want to cover your ears, Vikings fans, because his best fantasy season came all the way back in 2019, where he only averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game. However, the Minnesota Vikings have faith in knowing that they still have Justin Jefferson, signed a very lengthy contract extension, made him one of the wealthiest wide receivers in the league. And just a steady presence, although last year, due to injuries he sustained, only 11.6 fantasy points per game. He definitely wants to step that up. He only had 186.2 overall, and we know that he does want to help this young Vikings team and this young Vikings quarterback and J.J. McCarthy. And with the contract finally settled, I think he will have a breakout year. Last but not least, the Green Bay Packers, the surprise team of last year in this division. Let's just go over Jordan Love. I think that he's going to be seen more of as a super flex option in a 2 QB league. I certainly believe he has value as a starter, maybe a couple years down the road. But this wide receiver core is definitely one of the most interesting. This is going to seem like a weird comparison, but they feel like the Boston Celtics of wide receiver cores, mainly due to the fact that they spread the wealth around a lot. And the target share is going to be pretty even here. But I do believe their top receiver in terms of fantasy this year will be Jaden Reed. He's kind of a number 3 fantasy option. He did score 10 touchdowns last year. He had 13.6 PPR points per game, so if you're in a PPR league, he could be a nice little pickup. But a guy I want to watch out for in terms of this Packers receiving core, who might be a little bit stealthy, is Dontavion Wicks. Because last year he averaged 15.7 PPR points in 3 of his last 4 outings. I think that Dontavion Wicks is prime for a breakout year. But overall, the Packers receiving core is going to be one of the most balanced, so maybe shy away from them in 1 QB leagues. But overall, that should just about do it for the NFC North. A lot to pack in, a lot of new faces, sophomore slump seasons kind of progressing. So we'll have to see how this all pans out. But coming up next, we're going to transition to probably one of the worst divisions in terms of fantasy in the NFC South. It has to be talked about because we're doing all the divisions. We will be right back with that. You may want to tune out for this one if you're not a Bucks, Panthers, Saints, or Falcons fan. But it has to be done. So we'll be right back with that segment.